My name is Mike Hubbard. I'm the executive director here. And on behalf of Dr. Troy Payo, our president, university president, let me extend a warm welcome to you to our Dahlgren Campus. We are going into our 14th year here. And to my surprise, and probably to my chagrin, there are still a lot of folks in the northern neck who still don't recognize that we're here. That means we got to do a better job of messaging, getting the word out that we're here. By all means, you're welcome. Walk the building, see some of the artwork that's here that we've captured over the years. The students, it's a pretty remarkable place. So welcome to Northern Neck. It's always a good thing to have the governor's family back in the building. I'm extremely honored to have historian, scholar, down in South Carolina, we won't talk about that. But Woody Holton, Dr. Holton, back in here. I really hate this thing. Back in the house to share some knowledge with us. So, sir, welcome. If there's anything that you need from us, don't hesitate to ask. Melissa does not need an introduction. Everyone knows Melissa Coburn, the chair of the Northern Neck 250 Signature Speaker Series. We're just honored to be able to partner with the series to bring this great afternoon of scholarly pursuit and knowledge. So everyone knows where the bathrooms are at. I should have started, get the priorities right. But welcome once again. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. And welcome to the University of Mary Washington. Melissa?
Thank you so much, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. It is so good to see you here. I see a lot of familiar faces and just want to thank you for coming back out to support this series. So on behalf of the Northern Neck National Heritage Area and the Northern Neck 250 Coalition, I just want to welcome everybody to the first event in the 2025 Speaker Series. The Signature Speaker Series focuses on Revolutionary era history of the Northern Neck, and it's part of a 4-year commemoration of the birth of our nation. This year's theme is We the People. We the people is a powerful and foundational phrase in our culture. It's symbolic of an ever-changing idea about belonging and the essence of our collective identity as Americans. Dr. Woody Holton is with us today to share his perspective on We the People by exploring how dynamics of the revolution became decidedly more complex than loyalist and patriot when viewed through the lens of broader circumstances of that time. Before introducing our speaker, we'd like to ask that you take just a moment to silence your cell phones. And if you hold your questions till the end of the presentation, we would appreciate that. We're going to leave plenty of time to talk more in detail with Dr. Holton. So now it's my pleasure to tell you more about our speaker today. Dr. Holton holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of Virginia and a PhD in American history from Duke University. He's currently a professor of early American history at the University of South Carolina with a focus on economic history and on African Americans and women. His articles and reviews have appeared in numerous publications, including American Historical Review, Journal of American History, Reviews in American History, and the William and Mary Quarterly. Dr. Holton is also the author of 4 books, Abigail Adams, which won the Bancroft Prize, Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution, which was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize and the National Book Award, and Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia, which won the Organization of American Historians Merle Curry Award and is the subject of his presentation today. His most recent book, entitled Liberty is Sweet, An Integrated History of the American Revolution, introduces readers to academic historians' numerous recent discoveries about the founding of our nation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Woody Holton.
Literature degree. I don't know if I earned it, but I have it. Thank you very, very much. To quote the title of an 18th century book by Lawrence Stern, this has been a sentimental journey for me to come back to this rare region where the creeks are actually rivers, where if you use the normal amount of shampoo, you'll be in the shower an extra 10 minutes, as we learned when my parents moved here. And that reminds me of the third thing I want to say about the Northern Neck is that it occurred to me driving up that it was the only place my parents, who both made it past their mid-90s, the only place that they ever lived on purpose. That is, they moved to Richmond in 1970 when Dad got a job there, as Mike mentioned, and then moved to Northern Virginia when they were facing the prospect of having 3 kids in college at once and needed a nice Northern Virginia type job. But then they finally got to choose. And when they got to choose, they moved here and had a great 20 years, more than 20 years, if you count the visiting years beforehand here. So I feel like I'm visiting them by visiting you. And so thank you so much, Melissa, for the invitation and for all of you for coming out. So I want to talk about Force Founders because I want to talk about the people who, and I forgot to ask how to turn this thing, but there it is. We're coming up on that 250th anniversary. It's right around the corner, and we're going to hear a lot about these folks who appear on the back of the $2 bill. But I really want to focus today on 2 groups that don't appear on the back of the $2 bill, but probably should. And that will be Native Americans and African Americans. And I want to stress that I don't think this is a competition of who's more important, George Washington or Harry Washington, who was one of his many slaves who escaped him during the Revolutionary War and ended up fighting on the British side, and then as a free man living in Sierra Leone, where he helped lead a tax revolt, by the way. So some of these things run in the family. But I don't think we need to talk about a competition because the big case I'm going to make today is that these 2 groups, Native Americans and African Americans, influence the decisions of the elites. And that's why I called my very first book, Forced Founders, which I'm kind of celebrating the 25th anniversary of right now. And my students are always relieved when I tell them the new history, it's not so much about dates as it is about debates. So I'm not going to ask you guys to memorize a lot of dates, but there are going to be 3 major dates that I want to take you through chronologically. And the first is 1763. I'm working on a couple of projects that I'm very going to brag about. One is going to be on Disney Plus, a 6-part movie series. And the other is a big series in the New York Times Magazine. But they both made me so mad when they said, "Oh, we're going to start at 1774." And I go, "Oh no, the die was already cast," as King George III himself said in 1774. You got to go back to 73 if you want to understand why the revolution happened. So let me take you back to that year. And you probably know that England and France signed a treaty in which France got out of North America. Spain got the territory west of the Mississippi, and the British got everything east of the Mississippi. And I could kind of play the old game from Highlights magazine, what's wrong with this picture? Because the only group that's not represented here are Native Americans who actually controlled most of this territory long after the treaty. So this is what was agreed in Paris, and it was exciting for people, white folks in Virginia, because they had always had designs on the area that's now Kentucky. I recently learned that there was no bluegrass in Kentucky before Columbus. That's a European crop that somehow made its way over here and then took off and did what it's done for Kentucky. Is also, of course, I remember where Secretariat comes from, just down the road from here. So we must have some pretty good grass in Virginia as well. But anyway, by 1763, most of the land east of the Appalachian Mountains had been claimed. And that's why people like George Washington had their eyes on the area west of the mountains. And he had a friend from around here actually named John Posey, who had wrecked his family finances for various reasons. And the advice he gave him was that the greatest estates we have in this colony were made by taking up the rich backlands, and you could get them at a very low rate just basically by paying the government fees, which was nominal, and then dividing those big tracts into smaller tracts and selling them to other people. Anybody remember how George Washington, the director of his birthplace will know this, but anybody else know how George Washington got his start? What was the first work that he did? Surveyor, everybody knows. And so he really understood the value of that Western land and became a major speculator in Western land. I bet you guys also know how George Washington became such a wealthy man, and I'm going to recommend this to the gentlemen in the room, and that is, of course, that he married a rich widow, as did Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Madison, most of them. But he wanted to build on that wealth and create it and create more, and he did a great job of that. One 19th century person was interviewed about his great-grandfather, Thomas Walker, and he was trying to explain how big his grandfather was into land speculation. And he said, why, my great-grandfather, well, he was as great a landmonger as General Washington. So George Washington was the gold standard to whom everybody else was compared. And so for people like him, that 1763 treaty between England and France that gets the French out of America, it's like a starter's pistol. Boom! Go get that land. And lots of other people did that as well. That's when Native Americans came into it. It's a terrible image I have, but the best I can do to represent Pontiac, who was an Ottawa Indian living up near Detroit, who was one of many leaders of a rebellion in 1763 that captured 9 of the 14 British forts in the backcountry. So not the huge ones like Detroit and Pittsburgh, Fort Pitt it was called at the time, but lots of those smaller forts out in the backcountry. You can see the little flames in the green area are areas that are forts captured by these Indian rebels in 1763. And the British response to this Indian revolt was to send troops to put it down. But the other thing the British did was draw that heavy black line you see between the green and the yellow, the proclamation line of 1763, which I see at least one person from Kilmarnock remembers that maybe from high school, but really important. And the idea was that this would be a line separating the colonists from the Indians. And I want to be sure and say that the British didn't do this out of humanitarian concern for the Indians. But you guys all know, we've got a new administration in Washington that's determined to cut the budget and setting aside something that didn't exist then, like Social Security. But what was the biggest expense that every government has ever had until really the 20th century? What's the biggest thing that you pay for? Military, absolutely. And so the British were trying to avoid another war against the Indians by drawing that line. So it's not out of humanitarian purposes, but to avoid a war, they drew that line and said nobody can settle west of that line. Now, if you're Michael Landon and you have a family and you want to just go out there and set up a little house on the prairie, you can still do that because it's not like they put up a Great Wall of China along that line. But here's what the line did do. It stopped land speculators like George Washington, who didn't really want to live in the West, but wanted to acquire land in the West and then divide it up, survey it, and sell it. He couldn't get title to the land. So I've got an old Prius out here that I'd really love to sell you, but I can't right now because I don't have the title with me. I can't sign the title over. And in the same way, you can't buy a house without title. So this really did shut down land speculation, so much so that 6 years later, in 1769, the Virginia House of Burgesses, which at one point had met in a building like this. By the time this building burned down in like 1752, so the one they have in Williamsburg is completely inaccurate, as they acknowledge, but it's the only one they have the plans for. But anyway, they met in a building near here, and the legislature, which included not only George Washington, but Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, who were also both major land speculators, just about everybody was, they sent a memorial to the King of England saying, hey, that proclamation line that you drew between the green and the yellow 6 years ago, we need you to lift that, because it's the one other term that we all remember from high school: manifest destiny, westward expansion. We gotta expand, and we really need that land. And here's, I think, the most amazing thing I'll tell you this afternoon is that in considering what to do with that petition, let us have our westward expansion, the king was thinking not only about, I want to please my subjects here in the Virginia legislature, but he was also thinking about the female peace chiefs living on the Wabash River on what's now the border between Indiana and Illinois. And I can zoom in on a little bit there. You see where I wrote Wabash on top of the map? Because here's what the king, through his spies, the British had a very excellent intelligence network even then. He found out that the female peace chiefs living right where I've got the word Wabash there had organized an effort to rebel again against the British. Remember, they rebelled in 1763, and that didn't stop actual settlers from going out there. And so the settlers are encroaching on their lands, and the traders are cheating them, get them drunk, and steal all their beaver pelts and things like that. So, and the reason I'm showing this by showing you a wampum belt, a beaded belt, is that this was the diplomatic communique for people who were not literate in the sense that you and I tend to think of. But this is basically saying, hey, let's meet at the tree of peace and form an alliance together. And what the women these women peace chiefs, I should say, there's 4 kinds of chiefs among Native Americans east of the Mississippi. The ones you know about, the male war chiefs, but also male peace chiefs that run the village during peacetime, and female war chiefs who help decide whether to go to war or not, and what to do with prisoners. Do we kill them slowly, or do we adopt them and love them? And then the 4th group are the female peace chiefs. And it was this group who started building up peace among Native nations, and actually building it up in a way that hadn't been built before, because the Pontiac's Rebellion that I showed you, that was only Native American nations from north of the Ohio River, basically from north of Pittsburgh. So the Shawnees, the Delawares, the Kickapoos, you can see from the Miami Confederacy, we call some of them. And those nations north of the Ohio, it's kind of like the Civil War, were at long time at war with the nations south of the river, the 2 biggest being the Cherokees and the Muskogees or Creeks. But this effort in 1769 to build a vast Indian coalition to collectively attack the colonists, the people organizing this coalition for the first time ever crossed the Ohio River, not to go to war, but carrying diplomatic wampum belts like the one I showed you. And so these are really powerful nations. This doesn't sound like a big number, but it was at the time, more than 30,000 people. And if you can get them as part of your coalition, you can really do some damage to the British colonists. And all of that is the context for saying, you remember this petition in 1769 from George Washington and the rest of the assembly saying, let us have our westward expansion. Well, what did George III say in response to that? He said, no, I'm not going to let you have that land. I'm not going to revoke that proclamation line along the top of the Appalachian Mountains because I don't want to go to war against what would now be an even bigger coalition of Indians, including Southern ones. So I've got to do a quick personal thing, which is this is a map that appeared in Force Founders. And I just want to compare it to the version of the same map that I included in my most recent book called Liberty is Sweet, which is a mouthful. Here, it's like 600 pages. Sorry, don't buy it. I do have some copies, but don't buy it unless you get a lot of time. Anyway, you see, the main thing that I was influenced by a historian an anthropologist named Helen Hornbeck Tanner, and she said, don't just vaguely write the name Chickasaw and Choctaw and Cherokee out there. They had towns, so show us their towns. And I couldn't show you all other towns. The other thing she said was they also had boundaries, and the boundaries were often contested, but you should show the boundaries too. So it was an interesting difference for me, but just to compare my version of at least I had the Indians there, which the earlier map makers hadn't. My whole generation was starting to do that in the 1990s. But we're now recognizing that it's much more complex, that you can draw boundaries, even if they're contested. And of course, there were Native American towns. The old maps would show Williamsburg, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, but none of the Native American towns. And that's one way things have evolved between 1999 and now. I want to say one other thing about these Native women who were creating this coalition. What's going on here is the green corn ceremony, which you do when your first corn crop comes up. If you're a Native American, almost all of the nations that lived east of the Mississippi and south of the St. Lawrence grew corn and had this big green corn ceremony. And historians have described it as like if you were to combine Thanksgiving Day with Yom Kippur, with New Year's Day, and everything basically, because it's your time of atonement and forgiveness and celebration and thanks and all of that stuff rolled together. And the reason I mention it is that these natives who were building this coalition to attack the colonists, they had their big meetings where the Cherokee representatives are there and the Mohawk representatives are there and everybody in between. They always had them during the green corn ceremony. Because remember, they'd been enemies of each other and they needed to stress what they had in common. And one of the things they had in common was religion, including the green corn ceremony. The other interesting thing they did was started referring to themselves as the Red People. We think of, there's a term that we used to call the Washington football team that we don't use anymore because it was pretty insulting in the 19th century. But the notion of Native Americans as red, which of course they are not. Some of you may be Native American, and others have friends who are Native Americans. They were never red, but the idea of us as the red people, Native Americans, it's now been discovered by Nancy Shoemaker at University of Connecticut, was invented by Native Americans probably in Mississippi because they used to wear red paint to go into war and red mud down there for whatever set of reasons. They actually invented the term. Anyway, they started calling themselves the red people, the people of one color. So they're thinking in terms of race. Race kind of got invented in the 18th century, and we give white people credit, or I probably should say blame, for inventing this concept of race. But Native Americans actually participated in it as well. And to get ahead of the story a little bit, African Americans did as well. There was a real embrace of the term African. You think of African American as a fairly new term. It is fairly new. It's within my lifetime. But the notion of African Americans as part of an African diaspora, that really got going in the 1780s. Free blacks in the northern United States started calling their churches the Free African Church, and they had African societies and so forth. They'd kind of run from that word previously because whites had associated it with, jungles and savagery and all that. But now they were starting in the 1780s, free blacks and maybe enslaved people as well. They didn't leave as much written documentation, were embracing race. So anyway, I'm just talking about those Native American women's embracing race. And again, successfully, because the proclamation line, Washington initially thought it was going to be temporary, but the British never revoked it. The only thing that revoked it was the colonists' success in the American Revolution. So there's one way in which natives fighting for their freedom, the freedom to keep their land, influenced the larger freedom struggle. I'm going to lay down a dare for you guys before I get to African Americans, which is, the thing I want to say about Native Americans, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, we love the part about we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, so forth. That's the part we love. But the biggest part is the complaints. and the specific complaints. He has imposed taxes on us without our consent. That's the only time in all those 27 complaints that Congress mentions in the Declaration of Independence taxes, the thing we all know about. The Declaration of Independence mentions Native Americans and their land and the colonists' desire for that land 3 times. And so I think they're part of the story about why the colonists declared independence. African Americans, I think their bigger role in this comes a little bit later. And so the year I'm really going to focus you on here in a second is 1774, 1775. This I will not ask you to read, but it's fun to try to make your way through because it's Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. And Congress really marked it up. One of the places you really see it is at the very end. He had a secular closing. You know, we are now free and independent states. And Congress, other members of Congress were more religious than Jefferson. So they added 2 phrases, with firm reliance on divine providence, and the other one with appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. And this is my dare. I think I've memorized the whole Declaration. So if anybody wants to call it up during question and answer, I won't do the whole thing because it would bore you to tears, which I'm trying to do by other means. But if you want to give me any 3 words from the Declaration, I'll finish the sentence and give you the next one because it's my big accomplishment. Jefferson's big accomplishment, as you know, was the Declaration. And I told you Congress added to it religious phrases at the beginning and end, by the way. But the biggest thing they took out, which I also won't ask you to read, but it was the biggest grievance of all by far, just in terms of number of words, more than twice as big as any of the others. It was also the most passionate. It's the only one where he used all caps. Did the all caps come through in this version? It did not, but he did. Men, he put in all caps, and they took that out. And it's the only one where he did make a sort of a religious move. He accused the king of being a bad Christian, which still for a lot of people today, but certainly in those days, them's fighting words. What's this one that Jefferson thought was so important, but Congress took out? It's the complaint, a 2-part complaint. The king first made us have slaves, and then more recently, starting in 1774, the king made an alliance with those slaves against us slave holders. Now, the first part of that sounds a little weird. Really? They made you have slaves? The devil made you do it? But there's actually kind of a grain of truth to that, in that people like Jefferson, who had about almost 200 slaves at that point, they didn't need any more slaves. And they wanted to end the slave trade from Africa for a bunch of reasons, which we could talk about. I think you could compare it to the modern movement of, wanting to end immigration into the United States. They saw Africans as more dangerous than African Americans, people who'd been born here and never tasted freedom. I don't think they were right about that. Everybody who's enslaved wants to be free, no matter where you were born. But that was one of their reasons. Oh, and I'm wrong. They do say. They do have men in uppercase. That's accurately in this version that I found. Okay, but let's talk about African Americans' role. We are very close to a big anniversary that I'm afraid people are going to miss. Who recognizes that building on the left? What is it? Yeah, the Powder Magazine is what they call it. Not quite a conical building where they stored the weapons and the ammunition. And the person on the right is the last royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, a Scottish lord, as you can tell from his kilt. We all know about April 19, 1775, Lexington and Concord up in Massachusetts, but we had our own Lexington and Concord when on the next night, April 2021, he had Marines, British Marines, remove all of the, or not all, but as much as they could get of the gunpowder out of the powder magazine and secure it on a British ship. And you can imagine colonists were furious about that he seemed to be disarming them, thinking that there was going to be a war. They didn't know about Lexington and Concord, but both sides could see it coming. But there was one aspect of that I'm going to brag about discovering which is there was a slave context to that. Start with the fact that half of Williamsburg and 40% of the Virginia colony was enslaved. So just about every other person you meet as you walk down the street is either black or white, and a few other things, but mostly that. Well, enslaved people during the middle week of April 1775, all the way from Norfolk up to Appomattox County, Prince Edward County on the far left of my map, there were rumors of slave revolts in all of those places during that 1 week. And there had never been that many rumors in such a short time. And of course, all that area is connected by water, and a lot of the watermen traveling those routes are African American, so they're probably the ones carrying the messages. We know they did that in Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800. And so this is the context in which Governor Dunmore took all of that gunpowder out of the armory in Williamsburg, was that whites thought that the governor was trying to leave them, to disarm them right before a slave revolt, that the governor was trying to subject them to a slave revolt. So they made all these threats against him, and he threatened them back, saying, if anyone touches a hair on my head, I will, quote, reduce the town of Williamsburg to ashes, declare freedom to the slaves, and reduce the town of Williamsburg to ashes. So here is the governor of the colony, the largest British colony in America, threatening to start a slave revolt. And whites were furious. He's the guy who's supposed to protect us from our slaves, not the guy who was leading a slave revolt, but that's what he seemed to be doing. A couple of slaves went and knocked on the door of the governor's palace. They'd heard about his threat, and they said, look, we know you don't have a lot of white loyalists in Virginia. Almost everybody in Virginia is part of this rebellion. And so we will fight on your side, Governor Dunmore, if you'll free us. And he turned them away and said if they came back, he'd be whipped. But African Americans kept trying to reach Governor Dunmore. And eventually, in the summer, in his desperation, having fled Williamsburg himself, and he was on a British warship, he started to welcome them. And this is a painting by John Singleton Copley, one of the most famous American painters of the 18th century. And I show it because you see the person throwing the rope out to save Brooke Watson here in Havana Harbor in 1762. I think it's a true event that happened. This image is a reminder of how many of the people working on ships in Virginia and throughout the Atlantic were African Americans. And so the first person we know to have fled his owner in Hampton, Virginia, and gone to join Governor Dunmore was a man named Joseph Harris. Everybody knows where I am there. Norfolk, you can see the Norfolk Naval Shipyard to the left there, still very much with us, and Hampton on the other side of the river. And what Joseph Harris had done, we think of slaves picking tobacco, but his job was he was a pilot, a river pilot and a harbor pilot that knew how to get those vessels with their deep drafts because of their keel to get them around all the sandbars and stuff. And so that's how he got Governor Dunmore to take him on, because he had it's like, I have a very special set of skills. And his was that he was a river pilot. And so the British took him on, and whites were furious that Governor Dunmore was harboring this man, and then even more they almost got a chance to catch him, because while he was operating as the pilot of a ship somewhere in the Hampton Roads, a hurricane came through in September of 1775, drove that boat ashore near Hampton, and he actually rescued the captain of his ship, put him, I assume, waited for the waves to die down a little bit, and got his hands on a canoe and rowed his captain back across Hampton Roads to the safety of the British fleet off of Norfolk. And so here he is really proving himself, and other African Americans escaped to the British and proved themselves as well. Another painting by Copley. This is a black man fighting on the British side, as you can see, in the defense of the island, in a battle for the island of Jersey, which was a British island, still is, off the coast of France. Well, here's my point about all this. By late October, early November of 1775, hundreds of African Americans had quietly come to work for Governor Dunmore, and he'd formed an official regiment in the British Army of these guys, and called it, because he knew his Bible, the Ethiopian Regiment. The Bible is very aware of Ethiopia, and the people there were dark-skinned and so forth, and so he thought he'd use the name Ethiopian Regiment. And here's my favorite story of the Ethiopian Regiment. They fought a battle on November 15th, 1775, against the Princess Anne County militia, Princess Anne County, of course, now being Virginia Beach. And the Ethiopian Regiment won that battle, and the commander of the Princess Anne County militia was captured in that battle by one of his own former slaves. So it's a complete reversal where the captor has become the captive, and vice versa. And I don't know if you've ever played this game. If you could go back to any time in history, I don't really need to talk to Napoleon, but I wouldn't mind being there for that conversation between Thomas Hutchins and his former slave and now his prison guard. In celebration, Dunmore had been waiting for a victory like that, and he got one, and he issued his Emancipation Proclamation, which is very similar to the one that Lincoln would issue. Now, Lincoln was anti-slavery in his heart, but as you all know, Lincoln didn't go into the Civil War to abolish slavery, just to save the Union. And he ended up doing, as he said himself, the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure, used that term in there, as a war measure. Well, Dunmore also issued an Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure. He didn't free his own slaves, but he offered freedom. If you are owned by George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, or any of the other rebels, as he called them, and the bigger if you can get to me, and you're able and willing to bear arms, then I will enlist you in the British Army and free you as a reward for that. I said able and willing to bear arms, quoting from this proclamation of Dunmore's, but research I did on Force Founders showed that the majority of the people who joined Governor Dunmore were women and kids, who, of course, they didn't think of as able and willing to bear arms in those days, but they found that there were. And a student of mine, one of my first teaching jobs was at then Randolph-Macon Women's College, and she found a list that the Americans had captured of black women serving in the British Army. Not holding muskets, but doing vital things like washing shirts, which have lice, and you kill the lice, you kill the typhus, and things like that. And I want to follow their story. I want to take their story in two directions. One is just to see what happens to them. A lot of you know that the British captured New York City in September 1776 and held it for the rest of the war. And so New York became the largest collection or gathering of African Americans anywhere north of the Rio Grande River, as enslaved people. Governor Dunmore was forced by disease breaking out to move his Ethiopian regiment, those who'd survived the disease, up to New York. And then hundreds of other African Americans converged on New York, so that by the end of the war, there were 3,000 black New Yorkers who had gotten this promise of freedom. And the colonists still tried to get them back, but the final British commander-in-chief kept that earlier promise that Dunmore and other generals had made, and generals had made. And where did they go? To one of the 13 colonies that had remained loyal. We all know about the 13 colonies that rebelled, but there are also all those British colonies in the Caribbean and Nova Scotia, and there were others like Quebec that remained loyal. And so that's where they resettled. And I've been up there and talked to one of the descendants. They use the term Black Empire loyalists, and people are really proud of that history. I will say whites and blacks are both proud of it now, but at the time, whites were pretty oppressive to blacks in Nova Scotia. So they got jobs as woodcutters, and there's a woman, we actually know her name. But the whites were pretty oppressive, and so about 1,200 of the African Americans who settled up there in Nova Scotia accepted an offer from the British government to go be the founders of a new British colony Sierra Leone in Africa, and their descendants are still there today. And we know of one, this is Harry Washington I mentioned previously. He made this whole odyssey from Virginia to New York to Nova Scotia to finally Sierra Leone. And of course, the people who've been brought into the slave trade, A, in many cases it was 3 or 4 generations earlier, and B, they're from all over, all the way down to Angola. But we know of one person out of those 1,200 who completed that odyssey, got to Sierra Leone, had been born near Sierra Leone. So he left Sierra Leone and walked to the home from which he had been kidnapped and trafficked 40, 50 years earlier, and appeared among his family as though appearing from the dead. Okay, so I said I was going to take this in 2 directions. One, that's a short summary, and I can say more during Q&A about the African Americans who fought for the British and what happened to them. But the other thread I want to follow from that is what was the white reaction to this alliance between enslaved people and the British. And there's no better person to follow that from is our Northern Neck friend, Landon Carter, who lived near Warsaw down on the Rappahannock River. It was about 40 miles from him. And I recommend his diary to you. It is very fun reading because he hated everybody. But he especially, and he hated the revolution early. You know, these guys, they're just going to stir up the working class. It's going to be bad for all of us. And but he hated the taxes too. So he was very conflicted about all that. But the thing that really made up his mind, was he going to be a loyalist or a rebel, was Dunmore's proclamation. He was sure the king, as soon as he found out about it, would fire Dunmore. But the king did not fire Dunmore, tacitly supported it, and that really helped convert him. William Byrd III, same thing, had actually been a loyalist and switched to the other side in response to Dunmore's proclamation. And I thought about retitling today's lecture, Landon Carter's Dream. And here's why. On June 25th and 26th, that night of 1776, 8 of Landon Carter's slaves grabbed one of his boats and ran away, escaped by water down the Rappahannock River and made it to the British Army and signed up with the British Navy and signed up with them and were free. But then a month later, here's what Landon Carter reported in his diary. He's talking about a guy named Postilion Tom. He'd been a postilion on his coach, so a top person spent a lot of time with Landon Carter, which may explain why he ran away. But Postilion Tom, I'm quoting the diary now, appeared most wretchedly meager and wan. He told me of their great sorrow. That is, Postilion Tom came home to Sabin Hall, Landon Carter's house on the Rappahannock River. He had come to ask if I would endeavor to get them pardoned, should they come in, for they knew they should be hanged for what they had done. So here is the slave who thought he hated being a slave so much that he would take this great risk of going off to become free, and now he wants to come and return and beg forgiveness from Landon Carter. This is all reported in his diary a month after Postilion Tom and the other 7 ran away. And then Landon Carter woke up, because the part that I told you about those 8 slaves escaping on June 25th and 26th, that was true. The part about them wanting to come back, that was a dream that he had. And you can see why Landon Carter's Dream would make a great title, because he wanted to believe they had loved him all along, that they'd served him willingly, etc. But that was just a dream. It had been a nightmare for them, and they escaped it as quick as they could. And this leads us to the larger, that's right, Sabin Hall, I forgot to show you. This leads us to a larger point I want to say. Remember I said that Jefferson complained both about having to have slaves, George III made us have slaves, and about this alliance between the slaves and the British in that long complaint in the Declaration of Independence. Congress got rid of all of that, the Second Continental Congress. They changed it to these 7 words. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. And not only is that a lot shorter, it's a euphemism. Not all my students know the word euphemism, but I bet most of you do. Just in case, though, it's a soft diplomatic way of putting it, so that the word slave never appears in the Declaration of Independence any more than it does in the U.S. Constitution, which, as what Sean Wonlitz at Princeton notes, they were embarrassed about having this grievance, but they wanted to express this grievance because whites were furious at the British for, as they said, inciting the slaves among us. But I want to see who's been really paying more attention than you probably should to the chronology. Because did I say about 5 minutes ago that the governor kept going to the slaves and saying, come on, won't you join me, won't you join me? And none would, and he finally got one to come and then tried to get another and finally talked that. Now, that's not at all what I said. I said that the slaves kept going to the governor and knocking on the door out of the governor's palace and saying, here we are, put us to work. And he turned them away, But finally, he needed a river pilot, so he took Joseph Harris, and he took more people. It was the slaves who initiated this alliance. So you see what's wrong. It is very nervy of me to try to correct the Declaration of Independence, but here's what I would correct if I was in Congress, is say, guys, let's at least be honest about this. It's not the king who incited the slaves against us. It is the slaves, some of the slaves, who incited the king, or represented by Dunmore as one of his governors, that stirred the British against us. They were the initiators of this alliance. And here's why that's important to me. I made the case at the start of the talk about how Native Americans, just in trying to hang on to their land, provoked the British to adopt the policy that angered people like George Washington and helped push them into declaring independence. Well, African Americans, in seeking their freedom, they provoked the British to adopt a policy, that is, Governor Dunmore's Emancipation Proclamation, and that policy really became, in the Declaration of Independence, it's the last one that Jefferson mentioned. They kept it at the end. In the 18th century, as I'm trying to do right now, you save the best for last. And so that's the thing they were angriest about. And so, to put it negatively, if enslaved people had done nothing, then the biggest grievance in the Declaration of Independence disappears. It was by them fighting for their freedom that we get this alliance with the British. And then I want to say one last thing. I've given my Forced Founders talk a bunch of times, but it's been a while, and it's really fun to look back on the book after 25 years. And I'll say one, besides having more complex maps, as I talked about, the other thing that I would do differently if they ever let me revise it is to note that nearly 10,000 African Americans would get their freedom by fighting for the British. But since I was writing about Virginia, and since this was fairly new stuff at the time, there had been a book by a black author named Benjamin Quarles in 1961 that said a lot of what I said about enslaved people. But anyway, not many other people knew about it. And so it seemed new. And so I focused on the British-Black Alliance. But I want to make sure you guys know that north of the Mason-Dixon line, your much better chance, if you were black, your much better chance of getting free was by fighting for the Americans. And Rhode Island formed an entire regiment that, it had a few Native Americans, a few white guys, but it was mostly African Americans. Anybody here seen the movie Glory about the Massachusetts 54th? Will you just raise your hand if you have this? Oh, good. My students have none of them seen it. I'm going to have to make them watch it. But the Rhode Island regiment was a Revolutionary War version of that. And you had blacks serving alongside whites in other regiments as well. And so you had about equal numbers, 10,000, just under 10,000 African Americans in the North got free by fighting for the Americans, and just under 10,000 African Americans got free by fighting for the South, fighting for the British here in the South. And I should have known this because when we went looking for these images, somehow those John Singleton Copley pictures that I saw you didn't occur to me. And so the picture that we found to represent African Americans, you like to have an image from the 18th century, from the Revolutionary War, is this guy on the left. I can zoom in on him. And he was there to represent the important role that African Americans had in the American Revolution. But the book is all about, or that chapter of the book is all about blacks fighting on the British side. But as you can tell by his uniform, this is a black guy fighting on the American side. And so the last thing I'll say, I promised my last slide, African Americans, second to last slide, is that African Americans fought on both sides, but no matter which side they were fighting for the same principle, which was freedom. And so the big reach that I really want to urge on you guys, and that we'll argue about and talk about, I hope in Q&A, is to say, this guy's obviously a patriot. He fought for his freedom by fighting for American freedom. He was in that Rhode Island regiment. But I would say this guy on the right is also a patriot, even though he was trying to kill my Carter ancestors, because he was fighting for freedom as well. And we've had all this debate. I noticed they've changed the name of Fort A.P. Hill to Fort, is it Walker? Yeah. Whatever it is. There's nothing we can all argue about too. But we could talk about the guys and which ones deserve a monument and all of that stuff. But what I bet you we won't have much debate about is the principles they laid down, which we now know in a way that they didn't apply to women as well as men and to all races. And so that's my basis for saying both of the two guys in the previous image were fighting for freedom, because they were both fighting for that principle. So thank you very much. I'm way over, but I really appreciate your patience, and I'm ready for your questions, et cetera, and disagreements.
Thanks so much, Dr. Holton.